The cinema industry, especially the Malayalam film industry, was shaken in 2017 after an actress came forward and filed a complaint stating that she was abducted and sexually assaulted by a group of men, including an actor in Kerala. Since then, the case has taken multiple twists and turns. Now, years later, the actress have come forward to reveal her identity by giving an interview to a journalist. Following the incident, a lot of question has been raised around the roles and responsibilities of a media house. To discuss this subject in detail, we have with us Mr. A.S. Panniselvan, a former readers editor of The Hindu. Hello, sir.
Hello, tell me.
So, sir, do the media houses have any specific guidelines that need to be followed while reporting on the sexual assault cases?
See, there are two guidelines which were evolved in the pre-digital era, and these two guidelines were given by the Press Council of India, and these two guidelines did not take into account the effect of a digital spread or about individual recording something and putting it out in public sphere. But at some level, what is happening today is that we are having a guidelines which was written in the pre-digital or analog era for a digital era. Therefore, that is one conundrum. Another thing is, there are also directives from the Supreme Court which is binding. For instance, the last judgment was given by a bench led by Justice Madan Lokur, and that bench consists of Justices Madan Lokur and Deepak Gupta. On December 11, 2018, laid down an absolute ban on media to publish or air the names or any material which may even remotely reveal the identity of the victims of sexual crimes, which means this is a binding law. The question is, you have a binding law which prohibits you from naming, and you have an activist zeal which says that when the victims themselves are willing to reveal their name, why are you shying away? The question is, not all victims are equal. Some victims have certain amount of protective cover in the name of either the popularity of that case or the sympathy what they have generated in that particular case, or even a fraternal support system what they get. But for a media house, we need to look at issue in its totality. There are many people who are vulnerable who don't have these type of protective structures. Can we afford to create a institutional framework which takes into account only people who have some sort of a supportive system and not about people who have zero support system? Because still the idea of stigma is a huge issue. And as long as we are not able to address the question of stigma in these issues, I don't think revealing is a very fair idea.
Do we have any internal or external frameworks as such that needs to be followed while reporting on the cases, sir?
See, there are two sets of things which have come up. One was the earlier Press Council guidelines, and later after the Delhi gang rape case, when Justice Verma Commission looked into this issue, they came up with certain amount of guidelines. For these two guidelines are robust in themselves. But the key question is, they are all still within the analog imagination. And the problem today is the digital proliferation of information doesn't distinguish between what is news and what is information. News is the one where you are subjected to something called editorial judgment. And in the editorial judgment, what we do is we redact certain issues. Therefore, redacting or the act of editing is a very, very responsible act. It's not censorship. It is, you take into account that your principal obligation is towards the people whom you are reporting, and hence your job is to minimize harm. Therefore, the idea of minimizing harm comes in the idea of redacting. Whereas in the social media platforms, you don't have such a exercise. Therefore, restraint is actually an empowering one. Restraint is not reducing power. Restraint actually empowers you to carry on with your task, because media is not about one issue or one person alone. Media is about an integrated one, and we also take into account people who are extremely vulnerable. And we are not going to create an institutional arrangement where perpetuator should not invoke whataboutery. Oh, you name them, but what about this? You name that person, what about this? This whataboutery is the biggest issue today. Therefore, the problem between analog and digital, if you reduce it down to the real conflict is whataboutery. Because in the whataboutery, they don't know where to draw the line between what is editorial judgment and what is censorship. Editorial judgment is you redact certain information which is not having any social relevance, or it's not going to empower anybody. If it is not going to empower anybody, and if you are redacting it, it's a responsible act. And I think we should understand the power of restraint in these issues.
There are several instances where the family members of the victims will stage protest seeking justice for the victims. So how do we report in such cases, sir?
See, as I said, it's much more difficult with the proliferation of media platforms. Where the old analog imagination, and it was very, very clear. In fact, earlier it used to be only one deadline, which was around 9:30. Today we are having a revolving deadline of every half an hour, there's a deadline. So with the evolving arrangement, the question is, what is the distinction we are going to keep in our mind? The distinction is, are you going to be a broadsheet or you are going to be a tabloid? If you are going to be a tabloid, then your idea is only reach. But if you are going to be a broadsheet, you have a sense of responsibility. You reconcile your freedom with responsibility. When you are reconciling freedom with responsibility, you are not going to take up the exceptional cases, because you are also aware of the fact that there are many more vulnerable people there. And using these exceptional cases, you are not going to render those people more vulnerable. That is the simple theory. It's nothing complicated in this issue.
As you said, it highly depends on the editorial judgment of the media houses. Do the media houses do enough to educate their reporters and sub-editors? Because a lot of times not all the articles go through the editor before publishing due to several factors.
See, media houses are under severe strain right now. The thing is, there is a resource crunch, and resource crunch is getting played out in different forms. But what we should keep in mind is we can't conflate the crisis in the newspaper industry or the news industry with journalism. Journalism should be viewed as an act independent of its fortunes as an industry. Its fortunes as an industry is under severe strain today. But what we should not do is, we should not conflate the crisis in the fortunes of the industry with the ethical grid within which this industry is located. If we understand that its ethical grid is very, very important, it has 5 fundamental principles. Those 5 fundamental principles are truth and accuracy, independence, fairness, humanity, and accountability. As long as we recognize that these 5 principles make journalism what it is, then it's a different issue. But to do that, we also need to have in-house self-regulation mechanism. So we can't say that we don't want external regulation, which everybody understands, because external regulation can quickly descend into worst form of censorship, where it's important to have self-regulation. But to have self-regulation, you need mechanisms. You need mechanisms for course correction. You need mechanisms for visible mending. You need mechanisms for going ahead and have a humility to say that I made a mistake and this is the correction I did. Therefore, all these things are embedded within self-regulation.
Do we have any uniform guidelines that could be followed easily by all the media houses? Or is it even possible to bring out a uniform guideline that would be followed by all the media houses, irrespective of the medium that they are in?
See, I don't think we can evolve a single standard for all these issues. As long as we have few principles in mind, then we will be knowing which is acceptable for whom. See, even in cinema, there is certification. For some certification says that, okay, at some level we permit these things. Therefore, the permissibility varies. For I think it is very, very important not to be too prescriptive, but to have a very, very clear ethical grid. And the ethical grid in these issues is our job is to minimize harm and our job is to empower people. If we recognize that our job is to empower people and to minimize harm, that will clearly say what is the line I am going to take. Therefore, if I am going to be a fully academic journal, then I have a much bigger leeway. If I am going to reach everybody, then my responsibility is much higher. Therefore, it depends on all these things. I think it's very, very important not to get prescriptive, because prescriptive one reduces the space for genuine exploration of ideas. Therefore, what we need is a broader ethical framework, and within that broader ethical framework, we use editorial judgment to see whether it applies for us or not. And if it is not applying for us, we should have the humility to go and acknowledge that we made a mistake, and we should have a mechanism for course correction. And as long as we have a mechanism for course correction, that's the best we as human beings can do.
Do we have that broader framework, sir? Broader guidelines?
Broader guidelines have been happening over a period of time. Actually, if you are looking at the best practices in journalism, from 2000 onwards, there have been attempts to compile all the best practices guidelines. There are about 250 guidelines around the world. There is enough guidelines. The key question is how much of these guidelines have been imbibed by newsrooms. I had a dual role. I was journalism teacher at ACJ, and I was also the reader's editor for the Hindu. First thing I noticed is that there was a gap between the newsroom and the journalism school. First thing we did is, when we are inducting people from the journalism school, we also try to tell them this is how the newsroom works. Newsroom is a deadline driven, but these core values you cannot compromise. For there is an induction process. For I think we have to have a proper induction process within the newsroom.
Thank you so much, sir.